On a sweltering August night in 1974, the neon lights of downtown Millbrook cast an eerie glow through the humid air, painting the cracked sidewalks in shades of electric blue and cherry red. The summer had been particularly brutal that year, with temperatures soaring into the 90s for weeks on end, turning the small Midwest town into a pressure cooker of tension and restless energy. In the distance, the mournful wail of a freight train echoed across the industrial landscape, carrying with it the weight of dreams deferred and lives interrupted. Sarah Elizabeth Monroe had no way of knowing, as she stood before her bedroom mirror, applying a final coat of mascara, that this night would be her last. The 18-year-old's reflection stared back at her with bright hazel eyes filled with anticipation, her shoulder-length auburn hair catching the amber light from her bedside lamp. She wore her favorite bell-bottom jeans and a peasant blouse she'd saved for weeks to buy, the fabric flowing like water around her slender frame. Tonight was the night she'd been waiting for all summer, the concert that would take her away from the suffocating confines of Millbrook, if only for a few precious hours. The music drifting from her transistor radio filled the cramped bedroom she shared with her older sister Caroline in their stepfather's dingy apartment above Kowalski's hardware store on Elm Street. The Carpenters' Top of the World played softly, but Sarah's heart was already beating to the rhythm of something far more electric. In just 2 hours she would be standing in Cleveland's Richfield Coliseum, watching her musical heroes perform live. The thought sent shivers down her spine despite the oppressive heat. Frank Morrison's voice boomed from the living room, cutting through her reverie like a rusty blade. "Sarah, get out here." The sharp edge in his tone made her stomach clench. Her stepfather had been drinking since noon. She could smell the bourbon from 3 rooms away, mixed with the acrid scent of his unfiltered Camels. Frank had been married to her mother for only 2 years before the cancer took Catherine Monroe away, leaving Sarah and her siblings in his reluctant care. He was a man shaped by disappointment, his dreams of escaping Millbrook's blue-collar trap dashed by a series of bad decisions and worse luck. Sarah smoothed down her blouse and walked into the living room, where Frank sat slumped in his worn recliner, a glass of amber liquid balanced precariously on the arm. The apartment's wood-paneled walls seemed to close in around them, decorated with faded photographs of happier times and a velvet painting of a crying clown that had always given Sarah nightmares. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the lingering smell of the TV dinner Frank had heated up for supper. "Where exactly do you think you're going, dressed like that?" Frank's bloodshot eyes swept over her with disapproval. At 43, he looked older, his face weathered by years of tending bar at Murphy's Tavern and nursing his own private disappointments. His dark hair was already showing streaks of gray, and his once athletic build had given way to the soft paunch of middle age. "I told you last week, Frank, I'm going to the concert with Tommy." Sarah kept her voice steady, though her heart was racing. She'd learned to read Frank's moods like a meteorologist reads storm clouds, and tonight the pressure was building towards something dangerous. Frank took a long pull from his glass, ice cubes clinking against the sides. "That long-haired freak? I don't think so, little girl. Not in my house. He's not a freak, he's my boyfriend, and we're just going to see some music." Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she spoke. Tommy Kellerman was everything Frank despised. Artistic, sensitive, with hair that brushed his shoulders and dreams that extended far beyond Millbrook city limits. He played guitar in a local band called the Electric Prophets, and talked about moving to California after graduation to make it in the music business. Music. Frank spat the word like it tasted bitter. "Bunch of hippie garbage. You know what your problem is, Sarah? You think you're better than this place, better than me." He stood up unsteadily, his 6-foot frame swaying slightly. "Well, let me tell you something, sweetheart. This is your reality. This apartment, this town, this life. The sooner you accept that, the better off you'll be." The sound of a car horn honking outside made Sarah's pulse quicken. Tommy was here, waiting in his baby blue Chevy Nova with its rust spots and temperamental engine. She could picture him drumming his fingers nervously on the steering wheel, his sandy hair falling across his forehead, as he checked his watch. They had to leave soon if they were going to make it to Cleveland in time. "Frank, please. I've been looking forward to this for months. I even worked extra shifts at the diner to pay for my ticket." Sarah's job at Rosie's Diner on Main Street was her lifeline, the one thing that gave her a taste of independence and the hope of saving enough money to escape Millbrook after high school. Frank's expression darkened further. The concert she was attending featured some of the biggest names in rock music, artists he considered dangerous influences on young minds. The year 1974 had been marked by cultural upheaval, with the Vietnam War finally ending but leaving behind a generation of young people questioning authority and traditional values. Frank saw Sarah's musical tastes as part of a larger rebellion against everything he held dear. "Over my dead body," he growled, advancing toward her. "You're not going anywhere with that degenerate. Not tonight, not ever." Sarah felt something crack inside her chest, a dam of accumulated frustration and grief, finally giving way. "You can't stop me. You're not my father." The words hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Frank's face went white, then flushed deep red. Sarah immediately regretted speaking, but it was too late. The truth had been spoken, and there was no taking it back. "Get out." Frank's voice was deadly quiet now, more frightening than his shouting had been. "Get out of my house, right now." "Frank, I didn't mean..." "I said get out." He hurled his glass against the wall, where it shattered into 1,000 glittering pieces. The bourbon left a dark stain on the wood paneling, like blood from an old wound. Sarah stood frozen for a moment, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. Outside, Tommy honked again, longer this time. She could hear the opening notes of Led Zeppelin's Black Dog, drifting from his car radio. The sound seemed to come from another world, a world where music mattered more than fear. Without another word, she grabbed her purse and rushed toward the door. Behind her, Frank had already turned back to his chair, reaching for the bourbon bottle with shaking hands. "Don't come back," he called after her, his voice thick with alcohol and regret he would never admit to feeling. Sarah burst through the apartment door and down the narrow stairs that led to the street. The night air hit her like a physical blow, but it felt cleaner than the poisonous atmosphere she'd left behind. Tommy was leaning against his car, worry etched across his boyish features. At 19, he possessed an innocence that Frank had lost decades ago, a belief that love and music could conquer anything life threw at them. "Jesus, Sarah, what happened? You look like you've seen a ghost." Tommy's arms encircled her immediately, and she breathed in the familiar scent of his cologne, mixed with cigarettes and the faint aroma of motor oil from his part-time job at Peterson's garage. "He threw me out," she whispered against his chest. "Frank threw me out." Tommy pulled back to look at her face, his green eyes filled with concern. "What do you mean, threw you out? Like for tonight?" Sarah shook her head, unable to speak. The magnitude of what had just occurred was beginning to sink in. She had nowhere to go after the concert, no home to return to. The realization should have terrified her, but instead she felt something unexpected. Freedom. "Come on," Tommy said gently, opening the passenger door. "Let's get out of here. We'll figure everything out later." As they drove through Millbrook's empty streets toward the highway, Sarah watched the familiar landmarks slide past her window. The Woolworths where she'd bought her first lipstick, the Paramount Theater where she'd seen her first movie, the park where she'd learned to ride a bicycle. Each place held a piece of her childhood, and she wondered if she would ever see them again. Tommy reached over and took her hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. "It's going to be okay," he said, though uncertainty flickered in his voice. "Maybe this is a sign. Maybe it's time for both of us to leave this place behind." The radio crackled with static as they left Millbrook's city limits, the signal from the local station growing weaker with each mile. Tommy fiddled with the dial until he found a Cleveland station playing American Pie, and they drove toward their destination with Don McLean's haunting lyrics filling the space between them. The Richfield Coliseum rose from the darkness, like a spaceship that had landed in the Ohio countryside. Its concrete walls bathed in spotlights that could be seen for miles. As they joined the stream of cars converging on the venue, Sarah felt her spirits lift despite everything that had happened. This was her tribe, thousands of young people who believed in the transformative power of music, who dressed like her and dreamed like her, and understood that there was more to life than what their parents had settled for. Inside the arena, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Sarah had never been part of such a massive crowd, and the energy was intoxicating. She and Tommy found their seats in the upper deck, and she marveled at how small the stage looked from their vantage point. But when the lights dimmed and the first chord rang out, distance became irrelevant. The music washed over her like a tidal wave, drowning out her fears and filling the empty spaces in her heart. For 3 magical hours, Sarah forgot about Frank, forgot about her uncertain future, forgot about everything except the pure joy of being alive in this moment. She sang along to every song, her voice blending with thousands of others in a chorus of youthful defiance. Tommy's arm was around her waist, and she could feel his excitement matching her own. When the band played their biggest hit, the entire arena became a single organism, swaying and singing as one. During the encore, as fireworks exploded above the stage and confetti rained down from the rafters, Sarah made a decision. She wasn't going back to Millbrook, not to Frank's apartment, not to her old life, not to the suffocating expectations that had been placed on her shoulders since birth. She would find a way to make it on her own, maybe even follow Tommy to California when he left for Los Angeles in the fall. The drive back to Millbrook was quieter, both of them lost in their own thoughts. The concert high was beginning to fade, replaced by the sobering reality of what came next. It was nearly 3 in the morning when Tommy pulled up in front of Sarah's building, the street empty except for a few scattered cars and the occasional prowling cat. "I don't have to go up there," Sarah said, staring at the darkened windows of Frank's apartment. "I could stay with you tonight. Your parents are out of town, right?" Tommy's expression was conflicted. "Sarah, I want nothing more than to take you home with me. But you need to talk to Frank. Maybe he's cooled off by now. Maybe you don't know him like I do." Sarah's voice was flat, resigned. "Frank doesn't cool off. He holds grudges like some people collect stamps." But even as she protested, Sarah knew Tommy was right. She couldn't simply disappear without trying to make things right. Her sister Caroline would worry, and despite everything, some part of her still hoped that Frank might surprise her with an unexpected moment of humanity. Tommy walked her to the door of the building, his footsteps echoing off the brick walls. The streetlight above them flickered intermittently, casting dancing shadows that made the familiar entrance look alien and threatening. "I'll wait here until you get inside," he said, though they both knew he needed to get home before his own curfew was violated. Sarah kissed him goodbye, tasting cigarettes and concert beer on his lips. "I love you," she whispered, the words carrying more weight than usual in the darkness. "I love you too. Call me tomorrow, okay? We'll figure this out together." She watched him drive away, the taillights of his Nova disappearing around the corner like dying stars. Then she turned and climbed the stairs to face whatever waited for her behind Frank's door. The apartment was dark when she entered, using the key she'd had since moving in 2 years ago. She could hear Frank snoring in his bedroom, a rattling sound that indicated he'd drunk himself into unconsciousness. The living room showed evidence of his continued drinking after she'd left. An empty bottle on the coffee table, cigarette butts overflowing from the ashtray, the stain on the wall where his glass had shattered. Sarah moved quietly through the apartment, gathering a few essential items and stuffing them into her school backpack. Clean clothes, her favorite book, the small amount of money she'd been saving in a jewelry box her mother had given her. If Frank was serious about throwing her out, she wanted to be prepared. As she was folding a sweater, she heard movement from Frank's room. Footsteps on the creaky floorboards. The sound of someone trying to move quietly but failing. Her heart began to race as she realized he was awake. Probably had been awake all along. "Sarah?" Frank's voice called from the hallway, slurred but alert. "That you?" She considered not answering, pretending she hadn't heard him. But there was something different in his tone. Something that wasn't quite the anger she'd expected. "Yeah, it's me." Frank appeared in the doorway to the living room, still wearing the same clothes from earlier, but somehow looking smaller, diminished. His hair was disheveled, and his eyes were red-rimmed from alcohol and something that might have been tears. "We need to talk," he said, settling heavily into his recliner. The empty bottle clinked against his knee as he moved, and he stared at it for a long moment before looking up at Sarah. The conversation that followed would be replayed in Sarah's mind countless times in the hours and days to come, each word examined and re-examined for hidden meanings and missed opportunities. It was a conversation about forgiveness and regret, about the weight of responsibility and the price of dreams deferred. Frank talked about her mother, about how much Sarah reminded him of Catherine, in ways that both comforted and tormented him. "I never wanted to be your father," he admitted, the words falling between them like stones. "I wasn't ready for kids, especially not kids who weren't mine. But Catherine loved you so much." And when she died, his voice trailed off, leaving the sentence hanging in the smoky air. Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, a softening she hadn't expected. "I know you didn't ask for this," she said quietly. "None of us did." They talked until the sky began to lighten outside the windows, working through years of accumulated resentment and misunderstanding. It wasn't a complete reconciliation. There was too much damage for that. But it was a beginning, a tentative peace treaty between two people who had been trapped together by circumstances beyond their control. When Frank finally stood to go back to his room, swaying slightly from exhaustion and the last effects of alcohol, he paused at the doorway. "You can stay," he said without turning around. "If you want to, this is your home too." Sarah nodded, though he couldn't see her. "Thank you. Just next time you want to go to one of those concerts, talk to me first. Maybe we can work something out." After he left, Sarah sat alone in the living room as dawn broke over Millbrook. The events of the night felt surreal, like scenes from someone else's life. She thought about calling Tommy to tell him what had happened, but decided to wait until a more reasonable hour. Instead, she made herself a cup of coffee and sat by the window, watching the town wake up around her. The morning light revealed a world that looked exactly the same as it had the night before. But Sarah knew something fundamental had changed. She had glimpsed a different kind of life at the concert, tasted freedom and possibility in ways that would make it impossible to go back to who she had been. The question now was whether Frank's newfound understanding would last, or whether the fragile peace they'd constructed in the darkness would crumble under the harsh light of day. As she sipped her coffee and watched the first commuters hurrying past on the sidewalk below, Sarah Monroe had no way of knowing that she had less than 6 hours left to live. The conversation with Frank, which had seemed like such a breakthrough, would soon become the last meaningful exchange she would ever have with another human being, and the promises they had made to each other in the pre-dawn darkness would echo through the years to come, a haunting reminder of roads not taken and words left unspoken. Outside her window, Millbrook continued its daily routine, unaware that it was about to become the setting for a mystery that would consume the town's collective consciousness for decades to come. In police stations and newsrooms, in diners and barbershops, people would debate the events of that September day, spinning theories and trading rumors until the truth became as elusive as smoke. But for now, in these last precious hours of normalcy, Sarah Monroe sat peacefully in her stepfather's apartment, watching the sun rise over the only home she had ever known, and believing that tomorrow would bring the answers she was seeking. The coffee grew cold in her hands as she dozed in the chair, exhausted by the emotional turmoil of the night. When she woke, it was to the sound of Frank moving around in the kitchen, the familiar ritual of morning coffee and burnt toast that had marked their days for 2 years. For a moment, everything felt normal again. It wouldn't last. September 1st, 1974 dawned, grey and humid, the kind of oppressive late summer morning that made even the simplest tasks feel like swimming through molasses. Sarah woke in her own bed for what would be the final time, sunlight filtering through the thin curtains and casting geometric patterns across the faded wallpaper. The events of the previous night felt like a distant dream. The concert, the fight, the reconciliation, all of it wrapped in a haze of exhaustion and residual adrenaline. From the kitchen came the sounds of Frank's morning routine, the percolator bubbling, the scrape of butter on toast, the rustle of the Millbrook Herald being turned one page at a time. These mundane sounds, which had formed the soundtrack of her life for 2 years, would soon become precious memories, replayed endlessly in the minds of those who loved her. Sarah padded to the bathroom in her bare feet, the linoleum cold against her skin. Her reflection in the medicine cabinet mirror showed the toll of the sleepless night. Dark circles under her eyes, her auburn hair tangled from tossing and turning in the chair. She splashed cold water on her face and tried to make sense of where things stood between her and Frank. The conversation they'd had felt real, but experience had taught her that Frank's moods could shift like summer weather. "Sarah," Frank's voice carried from the kitchen, and she tensed instinctively, but his tone was neutral, even gentle. "Coffee's ready." She found him sitting at the small formica table, still in his rumpled clothes from the night before. The newspaper was spread before him, but his eyes were focused somewhere beyond the headlines about Nixon's resignation and the ongoing oil crisis. A second mug sat steaming beside the coffee pot, an olive branch disguised as morning courtesy. "Thanks," Sarah said, pouring herself a cup and adding 2 sugars. The coffee was strong and bitter, the way Frank liked it, but she welcomed the sharp taste and the promise of caffeine clarity. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, the only sounds the ticking of the kitchen clock and the distant rumble of traffic on Elm Street. Finally, Frank cleared his throat and folded the newspaper with deliberate precision. "About last night," he began, then stopped, searching for words that didn't come easily to a man who had built his life around emotional walls. "I want you to know that what I said about this being your home, I meant it." Sarah looked up from her coffee, studying his face for signs of the mercurial anger that had defined their relationship. Instead, she saw something unexpected: vulnerability. Frank Morrison, the man who had seemed larger than life in her childhood nightmares, looked smaller in the morning light, older, more human. "I know," she said quietly, "and I'm sorry too, for what I said about you not being my father. That was cruel." Frank waved away her apology with a gesture that suggested the topic was too painful to explore further. "Water under the bridge. But we need to talk about ground rules if we're going to make this work. I can't have you coming and going at all hours, worrying me sick." The conversation that followed was awkward but necessary. 2 people trying to navigate a relationship neither had asked for, but both were committed to salvaging. They established a midnight curfew on weeknights, 1 o'clock on weekends. Sarah would call if she was going to be late. Frank would try to curb his drinking and his temper. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. "I should probably call Tommy," Sarah said eventually, glancing at the clock. It was nearly 10, and she knew he would be worried about how her confrontation with Frank had ended. "That boy seems decent enough," Frank admitted grudgingly. "Just keep your wits about you, Sarah. Boys that age, they've got one thing on their minds." Sarah felt her cheeks warm, but she didn't argue. It was progress that Frank was acknowledging Tommy's existence at all. "I will, and Frank, thank you for giving me another chance." He nodded curtly, already retreating behind the emotional barriers that protected him from intimacy. "Don't make me regret it." The phone conversation with Tommy was brief but sweet. He was relieved to hear that she and Frank had worked things out, though he pressed her for details she wasn't ready to share. They made plans to meet later that afternoon at Riverside Park, where they could talk privately without the weight of family expectations pressing down on them. "I love you," Tommy said before hanging up, and Sarah felt the words settle into her chest like warm honey. "I love you too." After breakfast, Sarah retreated to her bedroom to call in sick to her shift at Rosie's diner. She needed time to process everything that had happened, and the thought of serving coffee and pie to the morning regulars while her emotions were still so raw felt impossible. Rosie Martinez, the diner's owner, was understanding. She had teenage daughters of her own and recognized the sound of crisis in Sarah's voice. "Take the day, Mija," Rosie said in her maternal way, "but don't make a habit of it. Saturday's our busiest day, and I need my best waitress." With the day stretched before her, Sarah found herself at loose ends. Frank had left for an afternoon shift at Murphy's Tavern, and the apartment felt too quiet, too filled with the ghosts of last night's argument. She decided to walk to the library, hoping that books might provide the escape her restless mind needed. The Millbrook Public Library occupied a stately Victorian building on Main Street, its red brick facade and towering windows a remnant of the town's more prosperous past. Inside, the familiar smell of old paper and binding glue wrapped around Sarah like a comfortable embrace. Mrs. Henley, the head librarian, looked up from her card catalogue with a smile. "Sarah Monroe, what brings you here on a Saturday? Shouldn't you be working at the diner?" "Called in sick," Sarah admitted, though she felt fine physically. "Just needed some quiet time to think." Mrs. Henley's sharp eyes, she had been the town's librarian for nearly 30 years, took in Sarah's tired appearance and drawn expression. "Boy troubles?" she asked with the knowing tone of someone who had watched several generations of teenagers navigate the treacherous waters of young love. "Something like that." Sarah wandered toward the fiction section, running her fingers along the spines of books that had provided countless hours of escape over the years. She pulled out a well-worn copy of The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath, a book that had spoken to her sense of being trapped in a life she hadn't chosen. "Heavy reading for a Saturday," Mrs. Henley observed, appearing beside her with the silent efficiency that made some patrons swear she could teleport. "Sometimes heavy is what you need," Sarah replied, tucking the book under her arm. She spent the next 2 hours lost in Plath's prose, identifying with the protagonist's feelings of suffocation and desperate desire for something more than the conventional life mapped out for her. When she finally looked up, the library's grandfather clock was chiming noon, and she realized she should head home to get ready for her meeting with Tommy. The walk back to Elm Street took her through the heart of Millbrook, past the shops and businesses that had defined her childhood geography. Henderson's Five and Dime, where she had bought penny candy with her allowance. The Paramount Theater, its marquee advertising the latest Disney film alongside a double feature of horror movies. Murphy's Tavern, where Frank would be polishing glasses and listening to the complaints of men whose dreams had been ground down by factory work and disappointment. As she passed Murphy's, Sarah caught a glimpse of Frank through the window, his white bartender's shirt a stark contrast to the dark wood paneling inside. He was laughing at something one of his regular customers had said, and for a moment he looked younger, more like the man her mother had fallen in love with. The sight made her feel unexpectedly tender toward him. This flawed man who was trying in his limited way to be better than he had been. Back at the apartment, Sarah showered and changed into fresh clothes. A simple sundress that brought out the color of her eyes and sandals that her mother had bought her the summer before the cancer took hold. She was applying lip gloss when the phone rang, its shrill tone cutting through the afternoon quiet. "Monroe Residence," she answered, expecting to hear Tommy's voice. Instead, a woman's voice, crisp and unfamiliar, came through the receiver. "Is this Sarah Monroe?" "Yes, this is Sarah. Who's calling?" "My name is Detective Helen Walsh with the Cleveland Police Department. I'm calling about an incident that occurred last night at the Richfield Coliseum. Were you in attendance at the concert?" Sarah's blood went cold. Images flashed through her mind. The massive crowd, the chaos of thousands of people moving in the dark, the possibility of violence or tragedy that she hadn't even considered. "Yes, I was there. Is everything okay?" Did something happen? We're investigating a series of thefts that occurred in the parking lot during the show. Several vehicles were broken into, and we're trying to establish a timeline. What time did you and your companion leave the venue? Relief flooded through Sarah so powerfully that she had to sit down. Around 11:30, I think. Maybe 11:45. We stayed for the entire show, and most of the encore. Detective Walsh asked a few more routine questions. Descriptions of suspicious activity, whether Sarah had noticed anyone loitering near vehicles, if anything had been stolen from Tommy's car. Sarah answered as helpfully as she could, though she realized that in her excitement about the music, she had paid little attention to their surroundings. Thank you for your time, Miss Monroe. If you remember anything else that might be helpful, please don't hesitate to call. Detective Walsh gave her a number and hung up, leaving Sarah with a vague sense of unease she couldn't quite identify. The call had been routine, professional, nothing more than a police officer doing her job, but something about it felt off. Though Sarah couldn't put her finger on what. Maybe it was the timing. Why would the police wait until the next day to start calling witnesses about parking lot thefts? Or maybe it was the detective's tone, which had seemed oddly formal for such a minor crime. She was still pondering the conversation when another knock came at the door. This time it was Tommy, arriving early for their planned meeting. His sandy hair was still damp from a recent shower, and he wore the blue button-down shirt she had bought him for his birthday. The sight of him drove away her lingering concerns about the phone call. "Hey," he said, stepping into the apartment and wrapping his arms around her. "How are you feeling? You sounded pretty shaken up this morning." "Better," Sarah said, breathing in his familiar scent. "Frank and I talked. Really talked. I think we might actually be able to make this work." Tommy's face brightened with relief. "That's great news. I was worried about you all night." They walked to Riverside Park hand in hand, following the tree-lined path that Sarah had traveled countless times throughout her childhood. The park sat on the banks of the Millbrook River, a lazy waterway that had once powered the town's mills and factories. Now it served mainly as a scenic backdrop for young lovers and a place for families to picnic on summer weekends. They found their usual spot beneath a massive oak tree, whose branches created a natural canopy of green. Tommy spread his denim jacket on the grass, and they sat facing the river, watching the sunlight dance on the water's surface. For a while they didn't talk, content to simply be together in the peaceful afternoon. "I keep thinking about last night," Sarah said eventually. "About the music, the energy of the crowd. It made me feel like anything was possible." Tommy nodded, understanding immediately. "That's what music is supposed to do. It's supposed to make you believe in magic. Do you really think we could make it in California? Both of us, I mean." "I know we could," Tommy said with the certainty of youth. "You're smart, Sarah. Smarter than anyone else in this town. And you've got something special, a way of seeing the world that most people never develop. California would just be the beginning." They talked about their dreams for hours, spinning elaborate fantasies about the life they would build together on the West Coast. Sarah would write for music magazines while Tommy worked on his music. They would live in a small apartment near the beach, where they could walk hand in hand as the sun set over the Pacific. It was a beautiful dream, full of hope and possibility. As the afternoon wore on, other couples and families began to arrive for evening picnics and weekend recreation. The park filled with the sounds of children playing and teenagers flirting, the eternal rhythms of small-town life continuing as they had for generations. Sarah felt a pang of nostalgia for this place that had shaped her, even as she planned to leave it behind. "I should probably head home soon," she said reluctantly as shadows began to lengthen across the grass. "Frank will be expecting me for dinner, and I don't want to push my luck on our first day of the new arrangement." Tommy walked her back through town as the streetlights began to flicker on, their pale glow creating pools of illumination along the sidewalks. They stopped outside her building, reluctant to end what had been a perfect afternoon. "Call me tonight?" Tommy asked, brushing a strand of hair away from her face. Of course. And Tommy, thank you for everything, for believing in me, for supporting me, for being the one good thing in my life right now. He kissed her gently, a kiss that tasted of hope and young love, and all the tomorrows they thought they had ahead of them. I love you, Sarah Monroe. Don't ever forget that. Sarah climbed the stairs to Frank's apartment with a lightness in her step that she hadn't felt in months. The future seemed bright with possibility, and the conflict that had seemed so insurmountable just 24 hours earlier now felt like a minor bump in the road. She had no way of knowing that in less than 2 hours, everything would change forever. Frank was waiting in the living room when she entered, and Sarah's good mood evaporated instantly. He was pacing back and forth like a caged animal, his face flushed with anger and something else, fear. His bartender's shirt was wrinkled and stained, and his hands shook slightly as he reached for a cigarette. "Where the hell have you been?" he demanded, his voice sharp with accusation. "At the park with Tommy. I told you we were meeting this afternoon." Sarah kept her voice calm, though alarm bells were ringing in her head. This was not the same man she had reconciled with that morning. "The police called," Frank said, taking a long drag from his cigarette. "They're asking questions about last night, about you." Sarah felt the bottom drop out of her stomach. "What kind of questions?" "About what time you got home. About our fight. About whether you left again after you came back." Frank's eyes were wild now, darting around the room as if looking for escape routes. "Someone saw you, Sarah. Someone saw you leave here again in the middle of the night." "That's impossible," Sarah said, though, even as she spoke, doubt began to creep into her mind. "I didn't leave. I was here all night after Tommy dropped me off." "Then explain this," Frank said, pulling a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket and thrusting it toward her. "This was slipped under our door while I was at work." Sarah unfolded the paper with trembling hands. Written in block letters were 5 words that made no sense. "She knows what you did." The room seemed to tilt around her as she stared at the message. "Frank, I don't understand. What is this supposed to mean?" But when she looked up, Frank's expression had changed again. The anger was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like regret. "Pack a bag," he said quietly. "We need to take a ride." "What?" "Frank, what's going on? You're scaring me." "Please, Sarah, just do what I say. Pack some clothes and meet me at the car. We need to leave town for a while until this blows over. I'm not going anywhere until you tell me what's happening." Sarah's voice rose with panic and confusion. "What did the police say? What aren't you telling me?" Frank moved toward her, and Sarah instinctively backed away. There was something in his eyes she had never seen before, a desperation that made him look like a cornered animal. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Something about your mother, about how she really died." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. "What are you talking about? Mom died of cancer." "I was there, Frank. I watched her waste away for months." "That's what everyone thought," Frank said, reaching for her arm. "But there's more to the story, more than you know." Sarah jerked away from his touch, her mind reeling with implications she wasn't ready to process. "You're drunk. You're not making any sense." "I'm not drunk," Frank said, and Sarah realized with growing horror that he was right. He was stone-cold sober, which somehow made his words even more terrifying. "Please, Sarah, we don't have much time. There are people who want to hurt us, and the only way we'll be safe is if we disappear for a while." The rational part of Sarah's mind was screaming that none of this made sense, that Frank was having some kind of breakdown, that she should run. But another part of her, the part that had loved her mother and trusted her stepfather despite their problems, wanted to believe that there was an explanation for the insanity that had suddenly engulfed her world. "Where would we go?" she asked, hating herself for even considering his proposal. "I know people," Frank said vaguely. "People who can help us start over somewhere new, somewhere safe." Sarah looked around the apartment that had been her home for 2 years. at the familiar objects that suddenly seemed foreign and threatening. The note was still clutched in her hand, its cryptic message mocking her confusion. Outside, night was falling over Millbrook, and she could hear the distant sounds of Saturday evening. Car doors slamming, teenagers laughing, the mundane symphony of a town settling into weekend routines. "I need to call Tommy," she said finally. "I need to tell him what's happening." "No," Frank said sharply. "No phone calls. No contact with anyone until we're safely away from here. Frank, please. You're not thinking clearly. Whatever you think is happening, we can work it out. We can call the police, get protection." "The police can't protect us from this," Frank interrupted. "Don't you understand? They're part of the problem." Sarah stared at him, seeing a stranger wearing her stepfather's face. The man who had raised her for 2 years, who had fought with her and forgiven her and tried in his clumsy way to love her, had been replaced by someone she didn't recognize, someone dangerous. "I'm not going anywhere with you," she said, backing toward the door. "Not until you tell me the truth about what's really happening." Frank's expression hardened, and Sarah saw something flicker across his features that made her blood run cold. "I was hoping you'd be reasonable about this," he said, reaching into his back pocket. The last thing Sarah Monroe saw was the dull gleam of metal in the lamplight. The last thing she heard was Frank's voice saying words that would echo through eternity. "I'm sorry, Sarah. I never wanted it to come to this." Then darkness claimed her, and the mystery that would haunt Millbrook for decades to come began in earnest. February 14th, 1975, 5 months and 13 days after Sarah Monroe vanished into the night. The Valentine's Day blizzard had been the worst in Millbrook's recorded history, dumping 18 inches of snow across the region and transforming the familiar landscape into an alien world of white silence. When the storm finally passed, it left behind a crystalline wonderland that sparkled under the weak winter sun, beautiful and treacherous in equal measure. 3 boys from Millbrook Elementary, Danny Chen, Marcus Williams, and Joey Kowalski, had convinced their parents to let them explore Whispering Pines State Park, a sprawling wilderness preserve 20 miles east of town. Armed with sleds and thermoses of hot chocolate, they set out on what they thought would be a grand adventure, following the snow-packed trails that wound through stands of ancient oak and maple trees. It was Joey who saw it first, a dark shape protruding from a snowdrift near the frozen banks of Clearwater Creek. At 12 years old, Joey possessed the morbid curiosity that often accompanies the transition from childhood to adolescence, and he approached the object with a mixture of excitement and dread. "Hey guys," he called to his friends, who were engaged in a snowball fight 50 yards away. "Come look at this." Danny and Marcus trudged through the snow to where Joey stood, pointing at what appeared to be a piece of fabric fluttering in the winter breeze. As they drew closer, the true nature of their discovery became horrifyingly clear. What they had mistaken for discarded clothing was actually the remnants of a human skull, partially buried in the snow and leaves, its empty sockets staring sightlessly at the gray February sky. Marcus, the oldest of the 3 at 13, immediately took charge. "Don't touch anything," he said with the authority of someone who had watched countless episodes of detective shows. "We need to get the police." The boys ran the 2 miles back to the park entrance, their sleds forgotten in their haste to report what they had found. By the time Sheriff Robert Garrison arrived with his deputies, word had already begun to spread through Millbrook's tight-knit community. A body had been found in the woods. Someone's nightmare was about to become reality. Sheriff Garrison was a 20-year veteran of law enforcement, a methodical man who approached crime scenes with the careful attention to detail that had made him respected throughout the county. But as he stood over the scattered remains in Whispering Pines, he felt a familiar knot of dread forming in his stomach. Partial skeletal remains were always the worst kind of case, difficult to identify, nearly impossible to solve, and guaranteed to haunt the families of missing persons for years to come. The scene told a story of violence and concealment. The bones were scattered across a wide area, suggesting that animals had disturbed the gravesite over the winter months. A forensic anthropologist from the state university would later determine that the remains belonged to a young white female, approximately 18 to 20 years old, who had been dead for several months. Most significantly, there was evidence of trauma to the skull consistent with a gunshot wound. What the scene didn't tell them was who she was. Dr. Elizabeth Hartman arrived from the state crime lab on a Tuesday morning when the temperature had dropped to -15 degrees. A forensic anthropologist with 15 years of experience, she had seen her share of difficult cases, but something about the Whispering Pines remains troubled her from the moment she began her examination. The victim was young, she told Sheriff Garrison, as they stood in the morgue's antiseptic chill, probably between 17 and 22 years old. Caucasian female, approximately 5 feet 4 inches tall. The dental work suggests middle-class background. She had access to regular dental care, including orthodontic treatment. Sheriff Garrison made careful notes as Dr. Hartman continued her preliminary assessment. Time of death. Based on the decomposition and environmental factors, I'd estimate she died sometime between late August and early October of last year. The cold weather would have slowed the process significantly. The sheriff's mind immediately went to the missing persons reports that had crossed his desk over the past 6 months. There hadn't been many. Millbrook was a small town where people generally stayed put, but one case stood out like a neon sign in his memory. Sarah Monroe, 18 years old, disappeared September 1st, 1974. Last seen arguing with her stepfather, Frank Morrison. But when Sheriff Garrison compared the case files, the details didn't match. According to Frank Morrison's statement, Sarah had left the apartment voluntarily after their argument and simply never returned. There had been no evidence of foul play, no signs of struggle, no indication that anything more sinister than a runaway teenager was involved. Moreover, the height estimate from Dr. Hartman was off. Sarah Monroe had been 5 feet 6 inches tall, not 5'4". The sheriff contacted Sarah's sister Caroline, who had moved to Pittsburgh after her sister's disappearance, unable to bear the constant reminders of loss that permeated every corner of Millbrook. Caroline drove back to Ohio immediately, her heart alternating between hope and dread as she prepared to confront the possibility that her sister's remains had finally been found. The meeting at the coroner's office was devastating in its inconclusiveness. The dental records were too degraded to make a positive identification, and without more sophisticated forensic techniques, there was no way to definitively connect the remains to Sarah Monroe or any other missing person. Caroline stared at the evidence bags containing her sister's potential remains and felt the familiar ache of unresolved grief settle deeper into her bones. "I'm sorry," Dr. Hartman said gently. "I know this isn't the answer you were hoping for, but without additional evidence, we simply can't make a positive identification." Caroline Monroe wiped away tears that had been building for 5 months. "So we're back where we started, still not knowing." Sheriff Garrison assigned Detective Ray Sullivan to take point on the case. Sullivan was a thorough investigator, with a reputation for not giving up easily, but even he found himself frustrated by the lack of concrete evidence. The Jane Doe from Whispering Pines became his obsession, a puzzle he carried home with him every night and turned over in his mind like a Rubik's Cube. The investigation proceeded methodically, but yielded few clues. The area where the remains were found was accessible by several hiking trails and an old logging road that hadn't been used in decades. Anyone with knowledge of the local terrain could have transported a body there without being seen. There were no witnesses, no forensic evidence beyond the bones themselves, no clear motive or suspect. Detective Sullivan interviewed Frank Morrison 3 times, each session more tense than the last. Morrison stuck to his original story. Sarah had left after their argument and never returned. He seemed genuinely distraught by the possibility that the remains might belong to his stepdaughter, but Sullivan's instincts told him there was more to the story. "Where did you go after Sarah left that night?" Sullivan asked during their second interview, his notepad balanced on his knee as he studied Morrison's body language. "Nowhere. I stayed home, had a few drinks, went to bed. Morrison's answers were consistent but somehow felt rehearsed, as if he had practiced them many times. Anyone who can verify that? I live alone, detective. There's no one to verify anything. Sullivan pressed harder during the third interview, laying out the timeline and asking pointed questions about Morrison's activities in the days following Sarah's disappearance. But without physical evidence connecting Morrison to the remains, the interview felt like shadow boxing. Lots of movement, but no solid hits. The case might have remained in limbo indefinitely if not for a clerical error that would have far-reaching consequences. When the Jane Doe's information was supposed to be entered into the National Database of Unidentified Remains, a miscommunication between agencies resulted in the paperwork being misfiled. Instead of being catalogued as an active case, the Whispering Pines Jane Doe simply vanished into bureaucratic oblivion. After 6 months of fruitless investigation, the case was reluctantly moved to the cold case files. The Jane Doe was buried in an unmarked grave at Millbrook's Eternal Rest Cemetery, her identity and the circumstances of her death remaining as mysterious as they had been the day 3 boys found her remains in the snow. Frank Morrison continued tending bar at Murphy's Tavern, but something fundamental had changed in him. Regular customers noticed that he drank more and talked less, staring into space with the haunted expression of a man carrying unbearable secrets. He sold the apartment above Kowalski's Hardware and moved to a smaller place on the outskirts of town, as if proximity to his old life had become too painful to bear. Tommy Kellerman left for California as planned, but without Sarah the dream felt hollow and incomplete. He sent letters to Caroline Monroe for the first year, asking if there had been any developments in the case, but eventually even those communications stopped. Some wounds, he learned, never fully heal, they just become part of who you are. Detective Sullivan retired in 1982, but he never stopped thinking about the Jane Doe case. He kept copies of all the files in his home office, and on quiet Sunday afternoons, he would spread them across his dining room table and study them like an archaeologist examining ancient artifacts. The case had become his personal white whale, the one mystery he couldn't solve despite decades of experience and dogged determination. The years passed, and Millbrook continued its slow evolution from industrial town to bedroom community. The old factories closed or moved overseas, replaced by strip malls and subdivisions that gradually erased the town's blue-collar character. New residents arrived with no knowledge of the Jane Doe case or the young woman who had vanished one September night in 1974. The mystery became local folklore, a ghost story told in hushed tones at high school parties and late-night diners. But some stories refused to stay buried. In the spring of 2016, a graduate student named Rebecca Chung was working on her thesis about cold cases in small-town America when she stumbled across a brief mention of the Whispering Pines Jane Doe in an old newspaper archived online. The case intrigued her, partly because of the mysterious circumstances, but mostly because of how completely it seemed to have been forgotten by official channels. Rebecca was a digital native, comfortable navigating the labyrinthine databases and social media platforms that had revolutionized investigative research since the 90s. She created a blog called Forgotten Voices and posted a detailed analysis of the Jane Doe case, complete with photos, timelines, and her own theories about what might have happened. The blog post went viral in ways that Rebecca never anticipated. Within days, it had been shared thousands of times across Facebook, Reddit, and Twitter. True crime enthusiasts picked apart every detail, offering their own theories and demanding answers to questions that had been dormant for 40 years. One of the people who saw Rebecca's post was Marcus Williams, now a successful architect living in Denver. Marcus had been one of the 3 boys who discovered the remains in 1975. And the memory of that February morning had never fully left him. Seeing the case receive renewed attention awakened something in him, a desire for closure that he hadn't realized he'd been carrying all these years. Marcus reached out to Rebecca through her blog, offering to share his memories of finding the body and connecting her with other people who had been involved in the original investigation. Through Marcus, Rebecca was able to contact retired Detective Ray Sullivan, who was initially reluctant to discuss the case, but eventually agreed to meet with her. Sullivan was 73 years old when Rebecca interviewed him at his modest ranch house in Millbrook suburbs. His hair was white and his hands showed the tremors of early Parkinson's, but his memory of the Jane Doe case remained crystal clear. He walked her through the entire investigation, sharing details that had never been made public and expressing his lingering frustration with the case's resolution. "It was Frank Morrison," Sullivan said, with the quiet conviction of a man who had spent 40 years thinking about the same question. "I never could prove it, but I knew it in my gut. That man killed his stepdaughter and dumped her body in those woods." "What made you so certain?" Rebecca asked, her digital recorder capturing every word. The timeline never made sense. Morrison claimed Sarah left around 3 in the morning after their argument, but none of the neighbors heard her car start up. That Mustang of hers had a loud exhaust. It would have woken half the building if she'd driven away in the middle of the night. Sullivan retrieved a cardboard box from his closet and showed Rebecca copies of all the original case files. The photos of the crime scene were disturbing but not particularly revealing. Scattered bones in a winter forest. Evidence markers placed around fragments of fabric and personal effects. But one detail caught Rebecca's attention immediately. "This necklace," she said, pointing to a photo of a small silver pendant found near the remains. "Did anyone ever identify it?" "Custom piece," Sullivan replied. "Local jewelry store made it, but their records from the 70s were destroyed in a fire in 1983. Another dead end." Rebecca studied the photo more closely. The pendant was heart-shaped with an intricate Celtic knot design, clearly handmade by a skilled craftsperson. It was the kind of unique piece that someone who knew the victim would instantly recognize. "Detective Sullivan, would you be willing to go on camera for my documentary? I think this case deserves more attention than it's received." Sullivan agreed, and over the following months Rebecca expanded her research into a full-scale documentary project. She interviewed everyone she could find who had been connected to the case. The other 2 boys who found the body, former colleagues of Detective Sullivan, even the forensic anthropologist Dr. Hartman, who was now retired but still sharp as a razor. The most difficult interview was with Caroline Monroe, who had spent 40 years living with the uncertainty of her sister's fate. Caroline was now a grandmother living in Florida, but the pain of losing Sarah was still raw after all these years. "People don't understand what it's like," Caroline told Rebecca as they sat in her sun-drenched living room overlooking Tampa Bay. "When someone dies, you grieve, and eventually you heal. But when someone disappears, you're stuck in this terrible limbo. You can't mourn them because you don't know if they're really gone, but you can't hope for their return because deep down you know they're never coming home." Caroline had kept Sarah's room exactly as it was for 15 years after the disappearance, finally packing away her sister's belongings only when she moved to Florida. But she had saved one item, a small jewelry box that contained Sarah's most precious possessions, including the silver heart necklace that had been her 18th birthday present. When Rebecca showed Caroline the crime scene photo of the pendant found with the Jane Doe remains, Caroline's reaction was immediate and visceral. "That's Sarah's necklace," she whispered, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "I bought it for her from Morrison's Jewelry on Main Street. It was a custom design, the only one like it in the world." The revelation broke the case wide open after 40 years of uncertainty. Armed with Caroline's positive identification of the necklace, authorities were finally able to definitively connect the Whispering Pines, Jane Doe, to Sarah Monroe. DNA analysis, which hadn't existed in 1975, confirmed what Caroline's heart had known all along. The remains belonged to her missing sister, but identifying the victim was only half the battle. Frank Morrison had died of liver failure in 1998, taking whatever secrets he harbored to his grave. The case was officially classified as a homicide, but with the primary suspect dead and most of the physical evidence degraded or lost, The chances of bringing anyone to justice were virtually non-existent. Rebecca's documentary, The Girl in the Woods, the Sarah Monroe story, premiered at the Sundance Film Festival and went on to win several awards for investigative journalism. More importantly, it brought national attention to the case and to the broader issue of cold cases that had been forgotten by overtaxed law enforcement agencies. The renewed investigation also uncovered several disturbing details that had been overlooked in the original inquiry. Phone records from 1974, discovered in a warehouse of archived documents, showed that Frank Morrison had made several calls to unknown numbers in the days following Sarah's disappearance. One of those numbers belonged to a man named Vincent "Vinny" Torino, who had connections to organized crime in Cleveland and had died in a car accident in. Detective Amanda Foster, who had reopened the case for the Millbrook Police Department, theorized that Morrison might have been involved in something far more complex than a simple domestic dispute gone wrong. "We think Morrison might have been in debt to some very dangerous people," she told reporters. "It's possible that Sarah discovered something she wasn't supposed to know, and that knowledge got her killed." The theory was intriguing but ultimately unprovable. Too many years had passed, too many witnesses had died, and too much evidence had been lost or destroyed. The Sarah Monroe case would remain officially unsolved, a tragic reminder of how justice could be delayed and sometimes denied entirely. But for Caroline Monroe and the other people who had loved Sarah, finally knowing her fate brought a measure of peace that had been absent for 4 decades. Sarah was laid to rest in a proper grave beside her mother in Millbrook's Hillcrest Cemetery, her headstone bearing the simple inscription, "Sarah Elizabeth Monroe, beloved daughter and sister." Tommy Kellerman returned to Millbrook for the funeral, his hair now gray and his face lined with the accumulated sorrows of a life lived in the shadow of loss. He placed a single red rose on Sarah's coffin and whispered words that only she would ever hear. "I kept my promise. I never forgot you." The mystery of exactly what happened to Sarah Monroe on that September night in 1974 would never be fully solved. But her story had finally been told, her name restored to history, and her memory honored by people who refused to let her disappear into the silence that had claimed so many other forgotten victims. In the end, perhaps that was justice of a sort, not the legal resolution that her family had hoped for, but the simple human recognition that Sarah Monroe had lived, had loved, and had mattered to the people whose lives she touched in her brief 18 years on Earth. As the sun set over Millbrook on the day of Sarah's funeral, Detective Foster stood in the cemetery and made a silent promise to the young woman whose case had consumed the last 2 years of her career. There would be other victims, other mysteries, other families seeking answers to questions that might never be fully resolved. But she would remember Sarah Monroe, and she would carry her story forward as a reminder that every victim deserves to be seen, to be heard, and to be remembered. The wind rustled through the oak trees that surrounded the cemetery, carrying with it the whispers of the past and the hopes of the future. Somewhere in that gentle breeze, perhaps, was the echo of a young woman's laughter, finally free from the silence that had held her captive for so many years. In death, as in life, Sarah Monroe had found her voice again.